Okay, it's beginning now. So thank you very much for inviting me to present this paper to you. And it's entitled Disarming Discourse, Thomas Merton's Breakthrough to Peace, October 1961 to September 1962. A curious publication associated with the Trappist monk Thomas Merton in the Merton collection in St. Michael's Priory, Milton Keynes, is a paperback entitled Breakthrough to Peace, 12 Views on the Threat of Thermonuclear Extermination, published by New Directions Publishing in New York in September 1962, a month before the Cuban Missile Crisis. No editor is credited, but only an introduction by Thomas Merton. This paperback is an anthology of previously published essays by notable peace writers. The full list of contributors is as follows: Lewis Mumford, Thomas Stoner, Norman Cousins, Eric Fromm, and Michael Maccoby, Thomas Merton himself, Gordon Zahn, Howard Gruber, Walter Stein, Herbert Butterfield, Alan Forbes Jr., Juice Merleau, and Jerome Frank. The publication date is 1962, and a spate of paperback books had begun to be published at this date in the United States, with the common characteristic concern of an approach to peace as equated with unilateral nuclear disarmament. Disarmament was a controversial topic during the dangerous year of a nuclear show of strength between the USA and the USSR, from the time of the Berlin crisis in October of 1961 to the Cuban Missile Crisis in October of 1962. The chief characteristic of this new genre of peace publication was its general suspicion of the professional diplomat and the disarmament expert. So this paper considers how Merton became informed on matters of war and peace through his correspondence network and by his reading. I will examine these interconnected themes from 4 different perspectives. The first is the Roman Catholic position on nuclear deterrence. The second is the forming of the Breakthrough to Peace project. The third is Breakthrough to Peace and Trappist censorship. And the fourth, the critics' response to Breakthrough to Peace. And I will emphasize that the importance of Breakthrough to Peace for Merton was that it allowed him to forge transatlantic coalitions with nuclear pacifists through correspondence. Merton envisaged the anthology as a transatlantic project with contributions from British, Catholic, and American intellectuals who reassessed the validity of a nuclear deterrence policy from scientific, psychological, sociological, and ethical perspectives. And I will argue that the selection of contributors was honed through a 3-way letter correspondence between Merton, his publisher James Laughlin in New Directions in New York, and Wilbur Ferry, who was vice president of the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions in Santa Barbara in California. This educational institution had grown out of the Ford Foundation's Fund for the Republic, 1951 to 59, that was dedicated to protecting freedom of speech and civil liberties threatened during the McCarthy era. Merton's casual association with the social policy think tank highlighted how he imagined he could place his writings at the disposal of others as a means to legitimate the moral high ground of nuclear disarmament. This in turn points to connections between Merton's literary influences and his outputs that were quantifiably different from the American Catholic mainstream that tended to rally around the flag at moments of national crisis. So the first theme I'll be examining is the Roman Catholic position on nuclear deterrence. The Roman Catholic Church did not support unilateral disarmament during the Cold War. The institution did, however, maintain a qualified acceptance of nuclear deterrence throughout the entire Cold War period, as a way to justify the holding of a precarious peace, while at the same time holding to the aspiration of multilateral disarmament in a nuclear world. Merton, by contrast, held an absolutist opposition to the deployment of nuclear weapons, even through a deterrence posture. Merton's stance aligned with an emerging Catholic nuclear pacifism whose adherents were members of the laity, although Catholic scholars were responsible for the formulation of the theoretical foundations of this new brand of moral pacifism. Historian Patricia McNeill mentions the influence of Walter Stein associated with the Catholic New Left in England on Merton's pacifism in the Breakthrough to Peace anthology. I have it here. So Merton believed that nuclear abolishment was the only legitimate ethical position for faith-based pacifists to hold in the nuclear era. And so he based his Breakthrough to Peace on Walter Stein's nuclear weapons and Christian conscience that had emerged from a symposium at the Dominican Retreat Centre at Spout House near Rugeley in Staffordshire. 5 contributors to the Stein anthology were university lecturers. Walter Stein taught philosophy and English literature at the University of Leeds. Elizabeth Anscombe taught philosophy at Somerville College in Oxford. Robert Marcus taught medieval history at Liverpool. Peter T. Geach taught logic at Birmingham University. And Roger Smith taught at Liverpool College of Art. The foreword for the book was written by Archbishop Roberts, who noted that freedom of conscience as being an appropriate Catholic response to nuclear weapons, and he noted that the contributors, quote, are far from regarding the absence of explicit official prohibitions in the field of contemporary defense as grounds for suspending the operations of conscience, end of quote. These Catholic intellectuals proposed that nuclear weapons constituted a new species of warfare and represented a challenge to Catholic just war teaching that was not being faced by moral theologians. The contributors to Stein's anthology were ignored largely by the Catholic English hierarchy, and Catholic bishops were suspicious of Catholic laity getting involved in moral debates that were the preserve of the magisterium of the Roman Catholic Church. Members of the Stein Symposium group were intellectual young Turks who demonstrated a mixture of Catholic moral philosophy and Wittgensteinian analysis. In this sense, they were engaged in doing a new form of applied ethics. The second theme that I want to look at now is the formation of Breakthrough to Peace as a project. Wilbur Ferry influenced the agenda for Merton's Breakthrough to Peace for New Directions Publishing. Broadly speaking, the anthology was a commitment to the abolishment of all war, not just nuclear war. And Ferry sent Merton essays by Lewis Mumford, a philosopher of technology. Merton had wanted to title his anthology The Morals of Extermination, but because of the bleakness of the wording, he changed it to The Human Way Out, inspired by Mumford's critique of nuclear arms race presented in a lecture under the same title on the 28th of September 1961 at the University of California, where Mumford was a visiting research professor of government affairs at Berkeley. Mumford was highly critical of the American technoculture that he perceived of as placing efficiency before morality. Merton echoed Mumford's sentiments in his letter to Walter Stein at the University of Leeds, in which he praised Mumford's critique of technology as, quote, where our weapons are telling us what to do, we are guided and instructed and nurtured by our destructive machines, end of quote. Merton approved of Mumford in his letter to Walter Stein, and Merton reprinted an abridged version of a previously published essay to Stein in Breakthrough to Peace, which highlighted Merton's support for the abolishment of nuclear weapons. The moral issue that Stein in England had grappled with was whether a credible deterrent could be maintained without an effective intention to resort to nuclear weapons, should the risk of deterrence fail. Undoubtedly, to render deterrence credible, it needed to appear that the determination to use nuclear weapons was beyond question. Merton, in his proposal for Breakthrough to Peace, was planning to use Stein's moral logic, as the basis to communicate the wrongness of intention, so as to argue for the necessity for moral restraint on both possession and use of nuclear weapons that might precipitate an accidental nuclear war. However, the evolution of nuclear policy meant that it was impossible for a moralist to devise a general moral theory to encompass the paradox of nuclear deterrence as a threat to use such weapons so that they would never be used. And again, that's important to keep in mind, that what Merton slightly gets wrong here is that the whole deterrence posture was so that nuclear weapons would never be used. And this is central, I think, in thinking through his particular position. Thirdly, I want to look at the publishing project and the Trappist censorship process. Merton played a double game of submitting his articles to be officially censored for publication, while at the same time privately circulating his Cold War letters in samizdat fashion within his correspondence circle. Merton redrafted similar content under different working titles without comprehensive revision, because he was motivated to do anything to support Catholic action for nuclear pacifism. Dom James Fox, Merton's abbot, intervened on Merton's behalf with the Trappist censors concerning the flurry of Merton's articles. Dom James wrote to the master censor, Father Paul Byrne, quote, "Now, another point from our end of the battlefield is another article by Father Lewis, Thomas Merton. It is not indeed a spate article, but sort of a preface to an anthology of essays in regard to the present world situation where the threat of nuclear destruction of the human race hangs over our heads," end of quote. Although the anthology mentioned was Breakthrough to Peace, that was being published by Lauchlin's New Directions in New York, Merton's preface, which was published as the anthology's introduction, needed to be first approved for publication by the Trappist censors. Dom James related to Father Paul Byrne the psychological battlefield they occupied, continuing to loop around Merton's so-called little articles against war and the ensuing volley of letters between Merton and the censors and his religious superiors. Correspondence between Dom James in Kentucky and Bourne in Georgia indicate that the reasons for the delay in censorship was a backlog in the processing of articles from other Trappist houses undertaken by a small censorship team, and it did not represent the nefarious arrangement that Merton had imagined it to be. Fourth, I want to look at the critics' response to Breakthrough to Peace. What was possible for Merton was to pass over editorial control of the Breakthrough to Peace anthology to James Laughlin in New Directions Publishing in New York. Merton had persuaded Laughlin to remove his name as the book's editor because of Trappist censorship rules. Laughlin wrote to Merton stating his view, quote, "I'm sorry that we can't say edited by Thomas Merton on the cover of Breakthrough to Peace, but if we can say introduction by Thomas Merton, that will at least be a big help in the marketplace," end of quote. Ironically, this made little or no difference to the critics who associated the work with Merton himself. Merton had committed to New Directions marketing Breakthrough to Peace as peace literature. And one critic, Harry Patchner, in 1962, evaluating writers on this diplomacy of peace, such as Eric Fromm, C. Wright Mills, and Charles Osgood, merely as amateur diplomats who projected to the public their fears for the future of humanity as expressions of their sense of shame at US wrongdoing abroad. Critics dismissed Merton because they perceived nuclear deterrence in political terms and not in the moral, theological mode that Merton was attempting to argue, but with little success. Merton's overtly moral criticism of national security did not resonate with critics because his perception was that the US was relying solely on nuclear weapons to defer and deter a Soviet attack, and it did not reflect the shift in the administration of President John F. Kennedy in 1961, which was a move towards minimum deterrence as a flexible response to the communist threat, but seemed rather to recall the massive retaliation of the previous administration of President Dwight D. Eisenhower. So you can see here that politically Merton is slightly out of kilter in his proposals around nuclear deterrence and his observations on nuclear weapons and peace. In reality, Merton was responding to the atmosphere of popular fear of nuclear weapons that was magnified by pacifists with whom he was corresponding at the time. Another critic, Nathan Kafitz at the University of Toronto, did see a merit in Breakthrough to Peace in questioning, quote, the mentality of our age, its willingness to contemplate and plan total destruction, end quote, with its emphasis on human values concerning the sacredness of the person and the human race in a world whose realities are deterrence and counterforce. Kafitz, however, noted that the book, quote, hardly contains the answers to the question it raises, end quote. Hedley Bull, a professor of international relations in London, evaluated the book as, quote, a protest towards the official Western policy of reliance on nuclear weapons, end quote. And the contributors made, quote, superficial and arrogant assumptions, end quote, that anyone who was unaware of the moral dimensions of the problem was a servant of some special interest. The issue for critics was that Merton and his collaborators had failed to acknowledge the threat of Soviet aggression that had required a deterrence posture in the first place. They articulated an irony of Cold War Western anti-protest in which it was the citizens within the free world who used their freedom to put pressure on their own governments to move towards a more stable nuclear policy. An enthusiastic review of Merton's work by Justice George Lawler was published in the first issue of Continuum in 1963. Lawler was a correspondent of Merton and was sympathetic to his position. The review praised the book as encouraging by speaking with, quote, the voice of sanity, and inasmuch as many of its contributors who had either in the past or present been vilified as unpatriotic, naive, or cowardly, continue to plead, in effect, for the lives of their persecutors, end of quote. Justice George Lawler had much praise for Breakthrough to Peace for its holistic thinking, but Kafitz and Bull were critical of Merton moralizing and oversimplifying the problem of nuclear weapons, maintaining the status quo, and where necessary, strengthening it would give the West, in their opinion, the best overall chance of continued peace and stability. So now, my conclusion. Merton's critique of nuclear deterrence articulated his condemnation of massive retaliation rather than revealing an awareness of minimum deterrence as a flexible response to the communist threat, which was US policy during the administration of President John F. Kennedy. Merton was not tempted to believe that American virtue was sufficiently developed, that the nation could be trusted never to misuse nuclear weapons. After all, it had been the United States of America that had dropped the first atomic bombs over Japan in 1945. While this action had ended the Second World War, it had ushered in the Cold War. Merton held the view that the Roman Catholic Church, as a faith-based institution and community, had a responsibility to protect life and future generations, and so had a moral duty to act as a moral persuader in calling for world leaders to eliminate the threat of nuclear weapons from international politics. It was Catholic activists, rather than Merton, who responded to Catholic personalism and gave Merton's pacifism and its writings their afterlife. Thank you.
Wow,